Welcome to Connect and Collaborate. Today's episode of Redefining Rural is brought to you by Colorado State University Global Campus. We join Michelle Murphy, Danielle LaPlatte, and Kirk Banghart to talk about the rural education system.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody. We're so glad to be here. I am surrounded by, virtually and in person, by just some really incredibly strong rural leaders, which is appropriate because our topic today is rural leadership. We're going to get into, we've got some of our strongest women rural leaders here as well, and in the second half of the show, we're going to talk about some issues specific to their roles as longtime women in leadership roles in Colorado, in rural Colorado. But first, we want to talk about rural leadership generally, and I'm going to ask our guests to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their district, where they work or have worked, what they're doing now, and what drew them to rural and leadership together. And Linda, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Michelle. I'm Linda Reed. I am the superintendent of Archuleta School District in beautiful Pagosa Springs, Colorado. This will be my 7th year as superintendent and my 11th year in the district. Also my last year. I am going to retire at the end of June next year, at the end of my 45th year as an educator. So 11 years here in Colorado. I moved to Colorado in 2009 with my husband as a retiree. So I have been back in the workforce. I didn't do retirement well the first time, so we'll see how I do the second time. But I have had the honor of working in 3 different states. I was a teacher in Ohio for 10 years and then moved to California, the other C state. And I was a teacher, a special ed teacher, and then I was a principal for 10 years there, and for 8 years worked as a consultant with the California Department of Education and Los Angeles County Office of Education with turnaround schools and districts at about the time that No Child Left Behind came along. So I've been part of the accountability movement for quite some time through multiple states and multiple positions. Our district is considered a rural district. We are up against the base of the San Juan Mountains and at the base, about 20 some miles from Wolf Creek Pass. We have the San Juan River that comes through town, and it is just a beautiful sportsman's paradise. A lot of second homes here. Our school district has grown over the last 6 to 7 years. We are currently over 1,700 students, and we serve all of Archuleta County, including some more remote communities, and over the last several years we are also serving students who are coming to us from the Jicarilla Apache reservation over the border in New Mexico, and that's added a wonderful flavor to our school district, and we are honored to work with these kiddos. So that's a little bit about Pagosa, and we are honored to be part of this call today.
Thanks so much, Linda. Carrie, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you. Carrie Yancer, currently the Director of Professional Learning and Operations at CASE, Colorado Association of School Executives. But prior to this position, I was the proud principal of 2 schools, 16 years in the same building at Hotchkiss Pre-K-8 in Delta County, over on the western slope. Delta County is a rural school district made up of 5 communities, 5 high schools, 5 communities: Cedar Ridge, Delta, Paonia, Hotchkiss, and Crawford, where I was the principal there in Hotchkiss, one of the first principals to have one of the first pre-K-8s when we built that, so that was pretty exciting. Spent 25 years in Delta County School District, and about 3 years ago, my husband and I decided to make the move to the East Slope, which was difficult, but I took a position up in Nederland at Nederland Middle Senior High School, which was a challenge all its own in respect.
The rural part of Boulder,
That's
right?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It was a rural school in Boulder Valley School District, and so had a lot of experiences up there that really were similar to my experiences in Delta County, however, also very unique and diverse. So being in Delta obviously is a rural community. I lived in Crawford, and at Hotchkiss Pre-K, the community is basically made up of farming, agricultural, and coal mining. And about 6-7 years ago, when the coal mining industry went down, had a huge effect on what we had to do and change with our different stabilities for our students. And based when I first started at HK8, my free and reduced lunch count was at 23. By the time I left, we were at 68.
Wow.
So, a lot of demographical, economical changes happened, and I'm happy to say they're on a positive rebound with the orchards and some of the farming and agricultural, and they really had to start thinking outside the box of economical rebirth and regrowth. But Delta County is a very progressive, small rural school district under some great leadership, so it's an honor to talk about rural education because it's my heart and soul.
Great, and we're super excited that you guys are here. And as always, I'm reminded that both Kirk and Danielle served as superintendents in small rural school districts. So we'll hope that they will chime in throughout the conversation. I think we talk all the time on this podcast about what different roles look like in rural Colorado, and that superintendents are often, they serve as the transportation director. They actually drive the buses.
Yep.
They're mowing the lawns, all of that. Talk to us from your experience. What is incredible about your leadership? What stands out for you about the passions in your job and in your space? And then too, what are some of the challenges that you face? Linda, we'll go ahead and start with you.
So I'm fortunate. I do have an assistant superintendent who wears probably 45 hats, which allows me to wear only 20. I can't say that I've ever driven a bus because I don't have a CDL. However, it's just different. I spent 23 years in urban California, and you just don't have the same access to resources. You don't have the same number of people. One of the things that I've noticed, we have the same reporting requirements that everybody else does. We have to have people that can multitask and be able to balance a whole lot of different responsibilities. And that's not always easy to find because people are so specialized nowadays. And to ask somebody to come in and go, okay, you need to do this, and this, and you need to be really, really good at it because that's the requirement now. It's not easy. And we went through a period with the economic downturn when I first started in the district where, the economy was so bad and people were leaving our community left and right. And kind of like what Carrie was talking about, we had to figure out how to diversify as a community, and we are now attracting more people, but it is a challenge. I can't say that it's not, but I also think that one of the benefits is that I know every single one of my staff members down to the bus drivers. I know their families. I know their challenges and their successes. I know their kids. And I think that adds a wonderful layer of community to a school district that you may not find in a larger setting. So those are a couple of things that I would say about being in a rural district that is very different than urban. We were talking to some of our colleagues at CDE about the data review for the state assessments, and they were saying, well, we had some of the bigger districts take a look at the data to make sure that everything was in line. And I'm saying, yeah, and the people that are taking care of that for me are also the board secretary, and she does all the data reporting, and she keeps all the track of human resources, and some of the larger districts have whole departments that are able to really look in depth, and granted, they have a lot more pieces of data that they have to look at, but those are some of the differences that I see.
Well, and for our non-education background members, CDE that Linda was referring to is the Colorado Department of Education. And I think we've talked a bit, if not we will be more so during the session and as advocacy goes forward, about sort of the overwhelming, for lack of a better word, data collection and reporting requirements as part of our state's accountability system and larger, and the great impact that has on rural districts because for many reasons, but they do not have the staff that larger districts do that are devoted just to that work. week. Linda, can you talk a little bit? You talked about how you had to diversify and change the way that you did things. Talk about how you engaged your community, your district leadership. That would be you and your board, I imagine, maybe building principals as well, to figure out what you needed for your kids.
So one of the things that we did was we actually did a year-long, what we just called a listening tour, and we had community meetings open to anybody and everybody, and the board just really went out and listened and said, so Archuleta County, Pagosa Springs, what is it that you want for your kids? What is it that really matters to you? And that became the basis of our mission, our vision. It's part of our strategic framework, but it was also very intentional because there are a couple of things that I'm sure other rural districts deal with, and one of them is being competitive when it comes to recruiting and retaining the best and the brightest. And we knew that in order to do that, to be competitive with surrounding communities that are larger and maybe a little bit wealthier than we are, we had to do something to increase our ability to pay our staff more. So this listening tour that the board did really set the stage for our successful attempt at passing a mill levy override last fall, which was the first tax initiative that the voters in this very conservative community passed in 20 years. The last time that they voted anything as far as funding for schools are concerned was 20 years ago when they passed a bond to build the new high school. So I think that has been one of the things. We have three comprehensive schools. We have an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. We authorized a charter school. They're starting their third year. I think that was another evidence of what is it that the community wants. And there was a segment that wanted a different kind of education for their kids, so we responded to that. The other thing that we did shortly after I became superintendent, I had an opportunity to speak with the wife of one of my new board members who in the past had a homeschool collaborative, and one of the things that I recognized when I moved to this community was that homeschooling was a big deal, and I didn't understand it. I wanted to find out more about why people chose to educate their kids in a different kind of setting rather than in the public schools, because the narrative was, oh, the schools are bad, therefore these people are homeschooling, when in fact that wasn't necessarily the case. And so we had a year-long advisory board that we created that was made up of parents of homeschool kids, and out of that came what we call our Pagosa Family School, starting its fourth year, and it is a shared schooling program where we provide a rich array of electives to kiddos that are either in homeschooling situations or in faith-based homeschool collaboratives, and they come to us for electives during the school day in a shared space with the middle school. Then after school, those classes are opened up to additionally to other homeschool kids and to public school kids. So it has broken down a lot of the preconceived notions about public school and about homeschool, and every year the number of students in that program continues to grow. At last count, we have 70 students in K through 12, and it has it's really provided a bridge between two different communities. So if you ask me, I think it is really honestly listening to what people want and then trying to figure out how within limited means to make that happen.
And don't you think, like when I reflect on my time in Delta County and the 25 years I was there, I always look at it as we're a school district, not a district of schools, that I think that
Absolutely.
community feel. When I think back, I think one of the things that I'm so proud of and I'm passionate about is that community feel. Like, you know, I knew not only all my kids in my community, but I worked in a couple of the communities within Delta County and Delta, as well as in Hotchkiss, and I lived in the Crawford area. But I think that sense of pride and community and what you see, I think, between the rural and the urban really is that connection piece, and being able
Absolutely.
to have that connection. I know when we hit some economical hard times, I really reached out to, I was very close to the mayor of our town. I had his kids, I had the superintendent's grandkids. We had these connections and these conversations, and I think it's that sense of community pride in our small towns. I mean, I used to always tell people I bleed red and white, and that's, and that was the way it was. And when we finally did pass a bond to build the new middle schools, it was a big deal. I mean, matter of fact, we ended up I had to convince the community in Hotchkiss to tear down a 100-year-old building. And we had, it was tough. But some of the things we talked about and it's a little bit comical now because that building has been now going on 16, 18 years that it's been up. But we have lion heads on the building, and people walk up and they would always say, I thought you guys were the home of the Bulldogs. How come they're lion heads? And I'm like, don't ask, because the old high school building, because that's what we were in with the hardwood floors, had lion heads on those old brick buildings. But that was one of the concessions we made with the community to, like you said, Linda, you listen to them, you hear them. And what I find is there in our community, in our small towns, those parents care just as much and want the same amount of education for their kids as they may get at a bigger school. And I think as administrators in our buildings, in our smaller schools, we have to be creative. Just like you were talking about accountability. Prior to becoming a school principal, I was a counselor. I didn't have a counselor. I was the counselor. I was the you don't know. I was the Department of Human Services at times because when parents needed it, when the corner store, I had two of my seventh graders stole a candy bar one time. The owner called me at 9:00 at night and said, "Hey, Miss Shancer, you need to come down here." So on my way I went. But those are the things I think that make it so unique and special. I mean, I look back and I look at the staff and I look at how many hats and, even from a scheduling and as a superintendent level, it's the same way. My superintendent not only had me running one building, but I was also helping up at the high school. I was doing all the FAFSA for them, even though, because they were like, you have counseling experience. I had a coach. And this is a funny story. When I first got hired in Hotchkiss, we were in the old building for almost a year before we got the bond. On my job assignments, I had to clean out the clinkers. And a lot of people don't know what clinkers are.
I was just going to ask you what a clinker is.
Clinker is the coal mine. Our old building was operated by coal. So if we wanted heat the next day, I had to last one in. It was either I was the last one in or the first one in, and I had to make sure they were clean so that when my custodian came in the next morning, he could fill the coal bin. He took it from the coal bin, put it in, and I mean those are great stories that I always think about, and I think about.
Is that the building that got replaced?
That was the building that got replaced. Yes, but the kids had responsibilities too, and
I think that's so healthy.
It is so healthy. I mean, I look at this is my 29th year in education, and I wouldn't trade those experiences there. And as a parent in rural, I have two beautiful girls that are now 24 and 21, and they went through the K-12 system in Hotchkiss. My oldest graduated with her associate's degree with 6 other of her classmates of a class of 41 because of the outstanding staff. My youngest daughter, little bit different track. She had 29 hours of concurrent enrollment and a welding certificate because they both did FFA and 4-H and those experiences. And then when my oldest got an athletic scholarship to college, the coach said to her, you know what, you may not be the fastest, she was a runner, the fastest runner in the state of Colorado, but they said you have the most diverse cross training because you moved hay bales. You did the responsibility. And those are the things that I think bring a small community together. And in small communities, the schools sometimes are the hub of what transpires.
And
that's a tough,
that.
I think from the stories that we're hearing, I would agree that one of the things that I see in small rurals is really it's about collaboration with your community.
Absolutely.
And those connections that you make with your community are really how leadership happens, because small rural districts are really understaffed when it comes to the abilities. We talked about wearing multiple hats, and so you have to really have those connections with multiple people in order to get things done. If it's a new building, it's to try to make programs happen. If it's your sports program, all those happen not just within the staff that is employed by your district, but it's about then the community connections. And so I think all of us as rural leaders have that experience where we got something done because someone in the community, and we had that relationship with that person in the community. And so I think one of the things that I see a lot of is that's how we accomplish stuff in the rural setting, is really like leveraging our community and our relationships in order to get things done.
If I could add on to that, I would say for us, part of one of the things I love about southwestern Colorado is through our BOCES, we have 8 districts that work really well together, and we share resources. Unfortunately, we've had some tragedies where we had a little special needs kiddo who passed away quite unexpectedly, and then we just had this outpouring of counselor help from other districts so that they were there for the staff and the families and the kids. And I think that's something that I have always appreciated, especially when I was a new superintendent. I could pick up the phone and call another superintendent in a neighboring district and say, hey, what do you think about this? How would you approach this? And I think that is, especially as a superintendent, because it's lonely out there, I have to tell you. And it's, I love my connection through CASE, but sometimes you need somebody that has that similar rural mindset and knows your community, maybe not as well as they know their own, but they drive through it on their way to Denver all the time. So they know, and we meet regularly, we meet on a monthly basis, and we do a lot of problem solving. Something else that has happened, which I think is really great from a leadership development standpoint too, is that we have the principals across these districts have principal or professional learning communities, and they get together on a monthly basis, and they do the same thing. So we're always cross-pollinating, which I really appreciate.
Which I think is really important when you look at that collaboration piece, because I think about, as Michelle said, and Kurt, the many hats that you have to wear in that leadership style, because in our smaller districts, we don't have necessarily a curriculum director or a director of special education. You cross-pollinate all those responsibilities, and you have to think about, the professional development end. When we would implement something, how would that do? Because you're always thinking of what would benefit my students the most all the way across.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, and like in your position as a superintendent and even as a building administrator, you cross paths with your school board member in the grocery store. You cross path with the parent all the time. So that inner relationship, the relationship is key, because you're not going to always agree, but you agree to disagree. Because I think the number one thing that I valued the most in my 25 years in Delta County was my community and my parents trusted and believed in the direction. They knew that what we were doing and the direction we were going was the best thing for kids. And from collaboration, and even as you talk about collaborating with other districts on the Western Slope, we didn't have a BOCES. So we kind of had a conversation with Gunnison and Montrose, and we created our own little unique group, which was so beneficial, because we started looking at what are other grant opportunities out there, what are the things that we can do, because I knew that we could provide the best education. I always tell people my job was to create a seamless education experience for every student, pre-K 12 and beyond.
I'm listening to you guys, and I'm thinking about this from my perspective as growing up in rural and only ever working in rural. I almost think that leadership in our rural districts happens naturally. So when I grew up as a rural student, I had 24 kids in my class, and we all did everything. We were involved in, as Carrie was saying, there was so much diversity, and you had such a broad range of experiences because you were in 4-H and FFA and played basketball and volleyball and ran track and
student council.
You were in FBLA and all of those clubs, and you were leading all of them because there was really no one else. And so I'm thinking back to the opening of the case conference maybe a couple years ago when Lisa Skarska was standing up there doing the welcome, and she was saying, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? And that was kind of the way it was for me going through school, and then becoming a teacher, a principal, a superintendent. It was up to you to get those things done. And really, you didn't know any different. You didn't know that other places existed that had all of this help.
That is so true.
They have specialized. And so I really do think that one of the advantages to being a rural leader is that you have a really broad skill set, and you know a lot of, you know everyone's job, you know what it takes, you know what the requirements are. And I think that is such a real advantage that we overlook all the time, because you're just involved in everything and you do what it takes to get things done.
We're going to head out to break, Danielle. Thank you for that. That's the perfect sort of wrap up about the rural leadership and rural realities, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate, featuring Redefining Rural, once again brought to you by CSU Global. Let's get started talking about women in leadership.
Thanks, Alex. We're glad to be back, and we're going to send it. You may have noticed Danielle is not in studio with us today, and we miss her desperately. But we're going to pass it off to you and ask you to talk about some of the statistics around women in leadership and rural education.
Yeah, so as we started talking about this episode and celebrating our women in rural leadership roles, we started taking a look at some of the data around the state of female versus male leaders. And so let's starting off with teachers. When we look at the state of Colorado, 75% of the teachers in our state are female, 25% male. And then moving up to the principal ranks, we have about 50-50, 49% female, 51% male principals. And as we move up and look at superintendents, then we see a bigger shift. So superintendents across the state in Colorado, we see 33% female, 67% male. And when we're looking at our rural school districts, it's almost the same, but we see a little bit less. So we have 29% female rural superintendents and then 71% male. And if we didn't include our BOCES in that one, but the previous one, the BOCES was included. So BOCES makes up, we have 22 different BOCES in our state. So BOCES is a smaller portion of that. And I know in our BOCES we have more female leaders in our BOCES than we would rural superintendents across the state. So, I mean, we see a decline as we move up the ranks as far as teacher to principal, principal to superintendent. And I think we wanted to dig into a little bit of maybe why that is and how we can encourage our female teachers and principals to pursue other leadership roles.
Danielle, I would say part of that, when I think about that, and we've talked a little bit about like growing your own, I reflect even on my own personal experience when I was a classroom teacher to a school counselor to a school principal. It was about that relationship and that connection and people keeping an eye out. And I look to how we encourage and how we push our leaders above us when we start. What are those character traits? What are some of those things? And then really helping with that. Like, I never thought about administration if it wasn't for my superintendent and principal coming into me and saying, have you ever thought about being an administrator? And as I think about that, I had mentioned earlier, I was the first, well, not the first, but at the time when I became a principal, I was the only female principal heading into that role, and I would sit at a round table at a principal's meeting with all males, and that was a little overwhelming in respect to where your leadership needs to go. And as I think about that, and I think about even pursuing superintendencies, it's trying to find that balance of support of what skill sets you need and how that looks, because as you said in those statistics, the statistics demonstrate there's not a lot of role models out there to kind of help us get to that when we start looking at it. I look to Monica, Linda, some of these, or even Karen Gibson in Delta County with that. But it's that conversation, because I was actually an assistant principal while Karen was a classroom teacher. And I remember talking to her about becoming a principal or getting her admin license, and then she ended up being the superintendent. And I think as we think about women in leadership in the educational field, I really think it's important that we make a conscious effort to have really good role models and peer mentorships in that to give that buy-in of how important it is. Because even as I've thought about heading that direction, it's like scary to dip my toes because I don't know all the ins and outs.
No, I was just going to say, I was when I moved to California, I was a teacher and I was working on my administrative credential. But I was a special ed teacher. I thought about I'd be a special ed director. I never had any ambition to be a principal. And I was really encouraged by some of the male leadership in the district where I was a teacher to take on a quasi-administrative role. And it turned out that the person who was the principal of that school was a woman, and a very powerful woman. She was the only woman principal in the district when she started. And then she went on to become assistant superintendent. I became a principal. She was a mentor. But I think back, she was an awesome mentor, but the superintendent was a mentor to me. And he kicked me out of the nest. I would have been happy to stay in that district forever, but he really encouraged me to explore other things. And so that's how I was for 18 years able to be in a leadership position in California. But when I moved to Colorado, one of the things that I noticed was down here in Southwest Colorado, there was one female superintendent, and it was Kim White up in Silverton, teeny tiny little Silverton, and everybody else was men. And I remember saying something to the BOCES director at the time about that, and his reaction was, "You think?" And I look at over the last 10 years how things have changed. The BOCES director is now a woman. There are 4 female superintendents out of the 8 superintendents in Southwest Colorado. I look in my little community. The town manager is a woman. The CEO of our hospital is a woman. So I think it's bigger than just education too. I think in rural communities, there is a recognition that women bring a different skill set to a job than men do. Not better, not worse, just different. And I think having that balance has brought a richness to a lot of different communities. And I think as I look at my little district here, we have, if you will, 5 principalships between our elementary, middle, high school, charter school, and family school. And of those, 2 of them are women, 3 of them are men. And 2 of the 3 men grew up here, have spent their whole lives here, and really know the community inside and out. And some of the other folks have come from someplace else, which I think also helps that balance. But one of the things that I have been intent on doing is growing teacher leaders. And so I started last year a teacher leadership cadre. There was a young woman that was working on her administrative credential and her doctorate. She came to me and said, "How can we make this work?" And I said, "You run with it, girl." And she brought together a group, and it was mostly women who are teachers, who are leaders in their buildings. They are not necessarily wanting to be administrators, but they want to be leaders. And they have brought ideas that we hadn't thought about from a teacher's perspective. So I think that's one way of growing leaders. But I also think as women, we have to advocate for other women, and not above and beyond men. Don't get me wrong on that. But I think women have a responsibility to grow and nurture and support other women. And that's, after 45 years, that's the conclusion that I've come to.
It's interesting because both of you said, and Danielle, I don't know if this was your experience, but neither of you thought about going into a district or a school leadership position until you were groomed. So till it was suggested by one of your mentors or leaders.
Right. And my mentor was a male. And now I am constantly out there looking, even as a school principal. I mean, right now I have a former student of mine who's a principal in St. Vrain, and it's wonderful. She's a female, she's a minority. It's just amazing. And you just look at all these examples of when you say advocating for each other, you really do, because you don't think, because historically you've had male leadership in the principalship or superintendency. But you really do. It's looking at growing your own, of seeing out there the cadre, of doing PLCs, of finding those skills and saying, you have the potential to demonstrate some leadership skills. Let me help polish those for you. Let's go for that. It's like, I tell people that's what fills my bucket, kind of at my role at CASE right now, is at the professional learning end, is filling that bucket of how can we help leaders be better at their craft, and what are the strands or the academies or professional learning that we can provide to make sure we're meeting those needs all the way across. Because women in leadership roles statistically is low. Our minorities are low in that, and all the way across rural educators. I mean, we have a hard time. Linda, you mentioned the beautiful country in Pagosa, and I always say that's what got people to come to Delta County, is we have a great schedule, and you could go hunting and fishing, and you could do all these great things. It's retaining and retaining those people to come there, and then you have to really grow your own. I mean, I was hired in Delta County at the young age of 21, and I ended up there on a flip of a coin. I flipped a coin, heads I stay, tails I go, and it was heads. And I stayed for 25 years. And it's the same kind of thing of, if I didn't have good mentors around me to help me, but I didn't have a lot of female role models in that respect. So it was uncharted territory of how do I go about that? And so one of the passions now is, how do we get more females in these leadership roles? Because to your point, it's not good, bad, different. It's just different. It's a unique perspective that collaborating all the way around.
Well, and we know how important it is for our students, right? We know that when we have a diverse team of teachers, the female students and the minority students feel empowered by that. And that may not be the right word, but, oh, wow, they look like me and they're in a leadership role. I can do that too. And I say all the time, we've got to get rural kids interested in the jobs in rural communities, and this grow your own piece that's taking off, I think, around the state.
I was thinking back to my time as a principal, and I was an elementary principal, and it was interesting. I had a board member approach me, and by that time, some of the first classes that were graduating, if you will, from the elementary school were now in high school. And this older board member, who was a very strong woman, she came to me and she said, "What are you teaching those girls at McKinley School?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "They're all the presidents of the clubs at the high school. They're president of the student body. What are you doing with those girls?" And I think it starts there. I think it starts long before we become adults. And that's one of the things that I encourage our administrators and our teachers to recognize kids for their strengths. And everybody has a strength. It may not be the same, but let's nurture those strengths, whatever they may be.
I used to always tell my kids, be proud of who you are and what you do always. You're the first and last person to look yourself in the mirror. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And it starts, I've been at all three levels, middle, elementary, middle, and high, and I think about that, of presenting those opportunities, because it used to drive me crazy when people say, "Oh, they can't get as good of an education if they could at a bigger school," or and I would go, "No way." I mean, that vast experience all the way across the board just is incredible of capitalizing on those skills. And like I said, what a great opportunity. Those kids, this past May, I was the commencement speaker for the high school, and I had those kids for 10 years. I mean, I knew them inside out, and it was so incredible to see them years later. But it's the same thing of looking at those strengths and saying, you can. You want to start this club? You want to do these things? Let's get out there. We started a garden project. Now there's this giant program going on, and all the way around. It's like capitalizing on the opportunities for them. And I look to the young girls of saying, because they always say, "Well, I want to be a teacher." I'm like, you can be whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. Or they would say, "How did you become a principal?" And it's like you said, it's like looking at that and seeing that change.
I think it's that space of, we talk about it all the time about we know our kids. and the power in knowing your kids and how to tap into that energy and what makes their socks go up and down, as a good friend of mine likes to say. And when we had Nikki, the superintendent from Campoa, here a few months ago and talked about when you engage your kids, find out what their interests are, that's empowering. That puts them into it. And then you start implementing programs in order to build those out based on their needs. That is an empowering piece for those kids, and they learn this. Wow, there's nothing I can't do. I walk into my kids' school. The kids are, whether they greet me or not, 9 times out of 10, or the rule rather than the exception when I walk into one of my members' buildings is, oh, hello, Ms. Murphy. Good to see you, Miss Murphy. Shaking my hand, looking me right in the eye. And, as the mom of 2 teenagers, the value in that and the incredible life skills that you get from that level of engagement just... I'm a bleeding heart for all that is rural, and that's probably one of the primary reasons.
It's a different environment. I will say I had quite a culture shock coming from the west slope to over here on the eastern side of the state. Not good, bad. It was different.
Across the divide.
It was different. It was just, and I think one of those things was, even now, so many of my former kids, they will not call me Carrie. They'll say, "Hi, Miss Yancer, it's good to see you." And they have been taught some just different levels of values.
Some of my superintendents call me Ms. Murphy because that's how they're elders, I guess, right? So let's talk a little bit. Carrie's here in her role as well as former strong rural leader, as the director of the professional development in CASE. I'm sure I butchered your title, but a little conversation about where the needs are. What is CASE doing for those rural leaders out there? Kind of opportunities.
A couple different things. First of all, I'm always open to suggestions. I tell people I'm one of those conceptual visionary people. I think of a lot of great ideas, and then I need a lot of help getting them off the ground. But so please share. I think it's, some of the things that we're really looking at is creating some of these cadres, cohorts. The Western Slope Superintendents Conference, I think, is an excellent opportunity, as Linda was saying, to bring some of those experiences, because it is so diverse. We still have the same state requirements, all the same things. We all have to get to the finish line, but how we all go about it is completely different. And I think there's some unique discussions that happen when you sit and talk to, Clint and Nucla, who was talking about, yesterday I was coaching, and now today I'm a superintendent. I have nothing in between. So I think providing some of those conferences and conventions for some of our rural educators, we've actually spent a lot of time talking about how to promote women in leadership. Annual CASE convention, we always do the Women in Leadership luncheon, which is well attended. It motivates people. Awesome. People are ready to walk out of there, but that's exactly what happens. It's like, okay.
We were wondering about that.
How do we
follow up?
Right. And that's kind of where my wheels have been turning since convention is where do we take that? How do we create this value add to what we've kind of planted the seed, but now we got to water it. So how do we do that? What are some of those suggestions of bringing together some cohort groups, some problem solving opportunities? So I think from the CASE aspect, those are some things we're thinking about, trying to figure out, making a strand of women in leadership, because I think it's important that we start growing your own statewide. All our small communities do a great job of, we grow our own within our community because we want you to stay in our community, but how do we grow that statewide for leadership? Because statistically, our superintendency overall is depleting. We have a lot of people that are wanting to retire.
A lot of turnover.
A lot of turnover. So we have to do that.
Are we seeing the same sort of shortages in principal and superintendent roles and qualified folks as we are in the teaching workforce?
Principal, for sure. I just actually did some research on that.
In the principal role, and I've had, we talked about growing our own, and I've had people that I've said, you've got these great leadership qualities. Have you thought about? And their response is, no way would I want to take on that job.
Hardest job in the district, I think.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
I look at my own 2 children who have been in the education system, and I said, why didn't you want to be a teacher? And they were like, or a leader or whatever. They looked at me and they said, Mom, we watched what happened. And I was like, whoa.
No.
And you don't realize that until you you reflect back. And they said, we loved the experiences we had, but yeah, I think statistically it is tough. So I think part of my job in my new role is emphasize that value, because nothing fills your bucket more, your heart, when you know you've made that ripple effect, and you just go, even in that one, it makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I think it flows up, right? I mean, I think we've been experiencing our educator shortage for quite some time. And I think then the next logical shortage area that we're going to have is in leadership. Mm-hmm. And so I really think we talk about all the time changing the narrative around public education in general, the teaching field. And I think we also have to change the narrative around what it's like to be a leader. We've talked today about so many reasons why it's great to be a leader in rural education, and so many benefits and advantages. And I just think that we need to continue to talk about that. And that was one of the goals we had today, was to spread the joy of rural leadership and being in these leadership positions, because there really are many advantages. And so as much as we hear about the challenges and some of the obstacles around it, there are so many positive aspects as well.
The sign that hangs above my desk and has forever is "Another Day in Paradise," and that's what I tell people. It's another beautiful day in paradise, because it's a great job.
My mantra is, as long as I get up every morning and say I get to go to work,
That's right.
I should be continuing to do this.
Right.
And I'm still saying that.
It's passion.
I hope
wonderful.
I don't say that in July, though, because then I'm going to have a problem.
Yeah, but we know most
We'll
educators,
find you.
right, you retire, but then this will be your second retirement, right?
Yeah,
So,
well.
I expect you to pop up in some of these leadership training.
Well, my
Women in
mind is
leadership.
turning right now. I'm
Right.
like, okay, Linda, I'm going to be calling you for a few things right now.
You among others.
Yeah. We're trying to redevelop the mentoring, coaching strand
Right.
through Case 2.
What else, talking about ideas for developing future rural leaders, and maybe getting some of our listening community at the end of one career interested in pitching in and going out to rural leadership and doing some rural administrating, for lack of a better way?
I would love to see like a traveling roadshow of spreading the joy, like the joy of teaching, but the joy of leading, and really take this roadshow and really see that, because there's so many people, educators that are on that cusp, but they're a little nervous to take the jump, because there is such that negative narrative about public education and what we're doing. And if we could figure out that little roadshow of the reasons why.
We haven't talked about school boards, but I think school boards play a very important role in leadership development and support. And so I know Case and Kadji work so closely together, and I appreciate that. But that might be something to think about, a strand for school board members, about how they too can support that sort of leadership development in their districts and their communities. Just a little idea that popped into my head just now.
Yeah, I wonder what the statistics look like in terms of male, female, minority representation in school boards, in rural school boards. I don't have a sense of it.
Mine's pretty male and white.
Yeah. That's my sense, as most of them are, but I don't have anything to back that up.
I have had women board members. I have a woman board member right now, but by and large, and I can't speak for other districts at all.
Well, it was interesting for me, because I'm not only a female, but I'm a minority, and that was just...
And you were young.
And I was young. When I took my first administrative job, I was 28.
It's remarkable.
And, my favorite story was the ag teacher, my first day on the job. He comes in, he's like, "Hey, kids aren't supposed to be in here." And I remember just like going, what did I do? He's a big guy, the big belt buckle. And I was like, I got to go home.
All right, we're about wrapping up our time. Thanks so much, Linda and Carrie, for joining us today. Daniil, we miss you. We'll see you back in studio next month. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening today. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube channel, and you can find this series at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Look up Redefining Rural. Have a wonderful day.